This is the BBC live programme. Here is the news.
Here is the second and final part of a two-part, 2-minute history of Brookfield, with a diversion into the history of Willow Farm. We left Brookfield at the end of the 1960s, having grown from 100 acres in 1954 to 435 acres. In 1970, Dan Archer retired and Phil and Jill moved into Brookfield. They sold Hollow Tree Farmhouse to Nelson Gabriel, who converted it into flats. Getting ahead of myself a little, I should note that Brookfield later bought it back to use as their pig unit, and later as a base of operations for the Fairbrothers Poultry and Pig Ventures, and more recently Josh's Hens. Brookfield expanded further in 1979, when neighbouring Meadow Farm came on the market. Phil was now in charge, and he bought 30 acres of Meadow Farm land. In 1983, he bought Willow Farm. Willow Farm had belonged to Hayden Evans, Pat Archer's uncle, and was worked by Tony Archer until he and Pat moved to Bridge Farm in 1978. At this point, Mike Tucker took over until 1983, when he and Betty moved on to Ambridge Farm, and Hayden sold up. Phil only retained 55 acres of Willow Farm land, selling 30 acres to Brian Aldridge, and the remaining 15 acres, a barn and the farmhouse, to Bill Inslee. Bill was a widower from Derbyshire, who sold his farm near Ashbourne to the National Coal Board, and had decided to make a new start raising rare breed pigs. After he bought the farmhouse, he let Neil Carter rent the barn to keep chickens, and when Bill died in 1986, he left the barn and 8 acres to Neil in his will. The farmhouse was bought by Dr. Thorogood, who let it to the Tuckers after they had gone bankrupt at Ambridge Farm. In 1993 they bought the house, eventually dividing it into two and selling the smaller half as Willow Cottage to a family called the Kemps, who then let it to Brian and Jennifer when they sold Home Farmhouse. But let's get back to Brookfield. When Dan died, Phil was forced to sell the 55 acres of Willow Farm that he'd retained, again to Brian, to settle a tax liability. He sold a further 3 acres containing a barn and adjoining buildings for conversion into houses. That left Brookfield at 462 acres, which is how things remained until the recent sale of 2 acres, supposedly for use as a paddock for a family pony, but now intended to be the site of an electric vehicle charging station.